What's going on, guys? Welcome back to Before the Whistle. I'm your host, Maddy, and I'm kind of jumping off this week's episode with somewhat of an introductory to a series that I think I'm going to explore throughout the month of, I guess, July. It's still technically June, but this is really the time that there's absolutely nothing going on the field from that type of perspective on what to analyze. For some people, this is the time that they kind of regroup and think about how they're going to really apply their coverage for the next season. Usually that's kind of the wheelhouse that I'm in right now, but now that I have something that's consistent through this off season, okay, well, what do I do with this downtime? And I'll admit, I don't really ever have downtime if I'm not actively working on my job. I've been either, learning the scouting academy or, quite frankly, and something I would recommend to everyone, reading a lot of football books. That's something, again, the scouting academy has been a great resource for, but I've just found that in the same way that I think that a lot of the conversations about football can get a little too much into the X's and O's conversation and less kind of about what actually makes the game tick. I feel in the same way in trying to learn about the game of football that articles and things that have kind of come out as modern coverage of learning the game, it's actually really hard to kind of parse through that stuff and figure out what matters. What I find myself doing more often than not is actually going back to older coaches, principles that are coming about from the 80s, the 70s. It's all a lot more simplified back then. And it's curious to me, as much as the game has evolved, what kind of coaching principles have remained the same, both in that more bare bones version that we were used to, and what common threads am I kind of seeing still come throughout this? So I think this month, what I'm going to do is really explore coaching as its own entity. I think that there's a scouting perspective that's really fascinating, building a team, building personnel, all things that I want to explore here. But I keep reading these coaching books. And yes, I have, somewhat of an interest in coaching that I'm still exploring on my own, but it's such a quintessential point of the game. And as much as we spend time breaking down, again, the X's and O's, scheming, game planning, personnel groupings, all of those come from decisions ultimately made from the head coach. But it's not just about a head coach making a decision. How does that message then get relayed down to position groups, to those coaches? How do those coaches disseminate that information to their players? And how do you guys all kind of hold this common theme? So each week, I guess, I'm going to kind of delve into another avenue of coaching that I'm interested in, be it part of a philosophy, an aspect, something like discipline. How do you coach that in players? What different leadership styles are there? And what does that word really mean? But also looking at examples of who I think are strong leaders, both in the college and NFL level, guys that seem how to know how to motivate, how to build an identity, build a program, a culture. And that kind of gets to be a little buzzwordy at an extent, but what's kind of the underlying foundation that exists that makes a successful NFL head coach? And quite frankly, if you ask me, I'll give you an unorthodox answer. It's everything that you see in Dan Campbell and the Lions, and that's kind of the avenue I'm going to delve into today. Coaching is just something I've always wanted to explore, both from a personal interest perspective of having an interest perhaps in going into coaching down the line. Okay, well, what does that really mean? How do you actually go about doing that? Especially as someone that's never played a down of football before, how do you think about going to coach them? What kind of inspired this idea this week was spending this last weekend at the Manning Passing Academy down in Thibodaux, Louisiana. It's a quarterback camp where college quarterbacks come and coach these guys up in high school. And I remember last year asking a question to Eli Manning in the introductory press conference, because he had really made it a point to say that this really isn't about the college quarterbacks themselves. It's about the guys that they're developing. So just kind of asking, how does this slow that down from that perspective? Is it an X's and O's thing, or is it a fundamentals thing? Kind of everything in the middle, but just again, that focus being on the development of these high school guys, not so much the college guys. But if you ask most media members, I think they go to cover the college guys, but what's really the draw there? What makes these guys want to come back for second, third seasons? Just thinking about Michael Pratt from Tulane, this is his third year down at the Manning Passing Academy. And as much as those kind of marquee events like the Friday Night Lights passing clinic put on by Nike get to show those guys really, air it out, their arm strength, their ball skills and things like that, I found it more interesting that they want to go back and continue coaching these guys. I think there's the obvious idea of shared motivation there, coaching quarterbacks, having that understanding. having that feeling of responsibility and weight that a quarterback has that, quite frankly, no other position is ever going to feel the same weight of. So I start there and I'm thinking, okay, quarterback to quarterback, that makes sense. But what I've kind of noticed in the NFL the last few seasons is, as much as these offensive gurus have kind of taken center stage as being the answer, and you see these whiz guys that are a lot younger and seem to kind of be quarterback whisperers. Yet, to me, the play at quarterback just has not been that sound the last few seasons. I don't necessarily think there's a correlation there, and it's not really what I'm trying to make with this, but it more sticks out to me that someone like Dan Campbell, who is a tight end, has the ability to have that kind of holistic sense of leadership that I think you're really more used to, again, coming out of quarterbacks. And that situation has always fascinated me over in Detroit. Dan Campbell came from the Saints, and he wasn't really someone that had been necessarily touted as a head coaching candidate really until that offseason. I remember him picking up a lot of steam as a potential candidate. And then kind of looking at the fact that he was an assistant head coach for the Saints, that stuck out to me as kind of, all right, well, let's put those training wheels on kind of thing. But that probably was one of the least attractive jobs I think that a lot of people would want, being that it's kind of been one of those teams that's in a perennial state of dysfunction, and there's really no identity. There's no consistency anymore with losing your longtime quarterback in Matt Stafford at the same year as Dan Campbell's first season. At the same time, I think there's something to be said about building a team from the ground up. I think if you look at Dan Campbell's introductory press conference, it got a lot of, not necessarily flack, but I think if you are someone that's a little more serious and was looking for that more in an introductory press conference and not so much comments about biting someone's kneecap off, might have felt a little bit of a disconnect there. But going back and actually reading what he was saying there, I think that we were all kind of missing the point of what he was really trying to get at in between the lines there. Go. So I'll get to the comments about the kneecap breaking and why, again, I think we all kind of missed the point there. But what actually sticks out to me first, and just looking back at his introductory press comment remarks, is thanking the people way before he started to get to anything else. And the fact that he really saw an identity in the city of Detroit, the fact that they're a community of fighters, that they've gone through a lot of adversity and that they continue to get back up. It's hard for me not to see the parallels there between what Sean Payton really said in his retirement press conference. I did air quotes on the video version because, it was just retiring from the Saints, for lack of a better term. But, all of the things that he said had nothing to do with the success of the team on the field from the perspective of winning the franchise's first Super Bowl, going to playoff games, consecutive seasons back to back, bringing a really unprecedented success to the Saints organization. He spent 90 minutes talking about Hurricane Katrina, the city of New Orleans, and what he would want to be remembered, like what he would like his parents to, I'm screwing this up. If his parents were still here today, what he would want them to kind of take away and making them proud kind of thing. That, to me, it all kind of went back to the idea of the proverbial kid in the candy store, where at the end of the day, as much as this turns into a business of money and competing and everything, it all comes back down to, I just think, that little innate kid interest in playing and loving sports. And coming into a city that, in the case of New Orleans, dealt with an acute tragedy, but somewhere like Detroit, where it's not Los Angeles, it's not this bumbling metropolis city where the economy is booming, there's no crime going on. I know that every city could make its case, but the fact that Dan Campbell played there, the fact that he could really say those things from day one, that stuck out to me the most. The fact that this was a job that he identified to his agent as saying, I want to get in front of the CEO and the owner, and this is the job that I want. I don't think if you surveyed that many guys that would have been as high on their list. And then to kind of get into the weeds of this, which is that idea of an overall philosophy and how that kind of went into the break stuff theme that people kind of took away from that press conference, was The city of Detroit is a city that's been kicked and battered, to put in his words, and that they're not going to take any more shit in what they're doing. And it's finding a way to overcome adversity. That's what I really took out of his kneecap remarks more than anything else. It's that it was going to take them 2 shots to knock them down. On the way up, we're going to take your other kneecap. And then if you knock us back down, it's going to take 3 shots this time. And then we're going to come up and take your other kneecap. And it's going to take you twice as many times the next time. And then we're going to just take, a hawk out of your body. And that was really the mentality, as we are the last one standing. To me, that's really what builds toughness in an organization. And then ending that with learning how to feel losses and really hurt from them. Reminding players that numbing yourself to bad times is the exact opposite of what you should be doing. Hearing a coach say that you should be in your feels, especially when it comes to losing, I think that we can kind of get used to these guys like Bill Belichick, who have been in this business for decades at this point, know how to deal with every win and every loss. But there's something about just kind of the unfiltered emotion of Dan Campbell dealing with the losses his first season there that made, I think, everyone want to root for him. But then you look at how the Lions performed on the field, and this idea of biting off a kneecap after having to be knocked down several more times and really feeling every loss and hurting from those things. You look at the fact that his first season as a head coach, they started out 0-8. This is a team that was one of the few teams to go 0-16 and never win a game. They hadn't won a game in almost a year when they beat the Vikings in week 13 of the 2021 season. This was after they lost their 8 straight opening games. They went to their bye week. They came back. They lost the Steelers in overtime, they tied the Steelers in overtime, and then they would go on and lose 2 more games before actually pulling out that win. Also, the fact that that win came off of a 4th down touchdown pass late in the game, that when you're talking about a team being bought in, yes, that's week to week, but it's also through 4 quarters. And the idea of motivational psychology and getting guys to remain in the game, that to me all ties back to the motivational style of Dan Campbell. And what further stuck out to me was after that week 13 win against the Vikings, what Jared Goff did immediately after that play. He made a beeline straight for Dan Campbell on the sideline. To me, really, that said enough, because I think both of them were aware that neither one of them were each other's kind of first choice situations. Both Jared Goff coming from playing in a Super Bowl with the Rams and living in Los Angeles, let's just be honest, to going to Detroit, a team that has a lot less success, especially in kind of the short term. And any of that success really coming from the quarterback that you're now swapping with in Matt Stafford and Megatron and everything like that. But I'm sure if you asked Dan Campbell who his preferred option was in year 1, it probably wasn't Jared Goff either. And yet you see this embrace happen in week 13. Then they would go on and end up beating 2 teams in the Packers and the Cardinals that went on to the playoffs, where, again, a lot of teams would have been checking out completely because your season is over when you're heading into a game, or when you're 0-12-1 at that point. And then the second season as a head coach, he starts 1-6. It would be easy, again, to kind of throw the pitchforks in and get a team's frustrations kind of boiling over. And then they have this miraculous midseason turnaround where they win 8 of their next 10 games and ended up with a winning record, 9-8. But again, it stuck out to me the most, their final win of the season coming in week 18 against it wasn't against the Seahawks, it was against the Packers that ended up sending the Seahawks to the playoffs instead of the Packers, even though the Lions were eliminated before the game started. Yeah, I don't really believe in tanking, quite honestly, ever that much. I think there's been enough instances of it that maybe it comes from an owner, maybe a head coach has the idea, but the idea that everyone's in this tanking together doesn't make that much sense to me. It doesn't make that much sense to me in games either. But it's also something to think about of maybe we should be resting our starters. Maybe we should be focusing on health, focusing on the next year. The fact, again, that he had these guys locked in the final week of the year to beat a divisional rival for nothing other than bragging rights, to me, that really shouldn't go unrecognized. And again, I think it all comes back to his idea of biting off a kneecap, because it really wasn't about that terminology at all. To me, it was about how many times after each one it's going to take you to knock that team down until they're the only ones left standing on the field. There's an idea of toughness in that as well. And how do you instill that toughness in guys that can't see the forest for the trees. How do you kind of employ those motivational tactics? I kind of followed them throughout that year. It was the final season of Sean Payton and really his first year without Drew Brees. And it was also the first time, at least since I was following football, that a disciple of a head coach that I followed, and Sean Payton, went off to another organization and then went off to, a pretty bad organization. I remember reading an article about how Dan Campbell was sustaining or instilling a culture in a team that at that point had an 0-8 record. Because as much as you have to focus on what's going on the field week to week, when you're in your first season as a head coach and you start 0-8, that's when a lot of coaches are on the hot seat. I remember reading that he would look at utilizing late game timeouts as a test of player response, who goes in and performs after that. And it reminded me a lot of Don't Eat the Cheese from Sean Payton. And that came from his adoption of Bill Parcells. It warns against complacency in light of success. But to me, it also can apply to the same thing when there's absolutely no success going on at all. How does your team still play? Who's willing to still concentrate and remain competitive despite the scoreboard? To me, there's a positive and negative aspect of that. And while you've seen the positive aspects play off a lot with the Saints, and how do you continue sustaining success, you have to figure out how to really get it going in the first place. And so those kind of things that might seem like they're a little random, or the time that Sean Payton left mouse traps in everyone's lockers as a reminder of Don't Eat the Cheese. It has that same kind of, for lack of a better term, cheesy air to it as biting off someone's kneecaps. But it all comes down to, again, motivating players and getting them to tick and care about things. And you're not always going to get that by showing up with a 15-page report of, okay, well, here are all of our weaknesses from the week before. Sometimes it takes something unorthodox in order to work. And that's really what I've seen the value in over in Detroit. Go. And when I think of the coaching clinic lectures that I've really resonated from or taken insight from, the most value to me comes from all of the lectures about motivation, leadership, how to build a program, how to build a philosophy. Well, I'm still trying to kind of figure out what exactly that streamlines into. It's this idea that as much as I think a good coach knows the X's and O's, knows how to tailor a game plan each week based on opponent weaknesses, specifics to that game plan, tailor that kind of thing, how do you communicate that to your players? How do you get these lessons across to them? How do you get them to buy in? How do you motivate them? It would be interesting to me if you asked a kind of a survey of coaches how many principles they draw on from psychology, if all of them were necessarily aware that they are. Because I think, again, sports psychology is something that can get this kind of mumbo jumbo thing assigned to it where people can't really see its value. And that's kind of why in previous episodes, I've taken the time to kind of go through my background and the fact that I do come from psychology and I spent time in the field. I spent several years of education working towards that skill set. And I wouldn't say that I've thrown all principles out the window just because I'm in sports. If anything else, I found kind of the best portal for me to bring forward these principles of psychology. And I think that that's what you see a lot of inside these coaching clinic lectures and their principles. I think back to when I wrote an article on Tajay Spears at Tulane heading into the draft and talking about his motivation and how it really stuck out to me that he was an intrinsically motivated player. Because I think that there are going to be players that you have that are going to be like Tajay, where all of your motivation comes from within, but you're also going to run into guys that really only respond to external motivation. And then you get into kind of positive versus negative reinforcements. B.F. Skinner was one of the leading psychologists in the field working on kind of reinforcing behaviors. We all hear about Pavlov's dogs and the idea of associating something with something else. So every time, these dogs heard a bell ring, they were presented with food. And eventually they would ring the bell and their mouth would start salivating, even if there was no food placed in front of them. The other big school of thought there was B.F. Skinner, and his idea of how we reinforce behavior was either through positive enforcement or negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement can come in, several ways, and so can negative reinforcement. It comes down to whether or not you're adding something on or taking something away from someone. So it comes down to kind of negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement. Then I also think about a conversation I had with Kurt Hester, the Tulane strength and conditioning coach, on here a few weeks ago. I had brought up something called the 4 tendencies. It's this book that I had read when I was at the VA working in psychology, and I was really curious on learning more about motivation. It was more of a self journey where I was trying to figure out how to motivate myself. Because at that point, I was looking to go into grad school and had just kind of learned that I had ADHD. How do I figure out how to get my brain to work towards a specific topic? Why do I find certain things more challenging than others? What I came away from that was, there are people that there's outer expectations and inner expectations. There are people that have a desire to uphold both inner and outer expectations. So usually the people you hear about that actually follow their New Year's resolutions and follow all of the tasks that they have to do throughout the week. There are some people that'll only adhere to outer expectations, and those are kind of obligers, people pleasers, people that if it just comes from within themselves, they struggle to motivate themselves. But if it's attached to something, that kind of gets to that B.F. Skinner idea of negative or positive reinforcement. When there's a consequence attached to your behavior that's coming from external factors, that's what motivates a lot of guys to get going. Then you're going to run into rebels, and those probably make your worst players because they don't conform to either expectation. And that one's just really difficult to work with. But then you have questioners, and I'm one of them. And that's really where there is no such thing as external expectations, because I end up having to internalize them, and then I'll find the motivation, but I have to understand why that action is important. Otherwise, without that kind of idea of context or urgency there, I'm just not going to be motivated to do that. Learning that about myself has helped me so much in learning how to learn, study, cover things, and do things in my daily life, and having to reframe things in my head so that they hold an importance to me and my internal motivation factors. Knowing that about myself and knowing that that's something that exists, knowing all these psychological principles, the psychology of learning, the psychology of motivation, how to be an effective leader in different areas. It's all about commonly relating to people at the same time as recognizing that each person is an individual and how does each person tick. I'm a questioner, but if I'm talking to a room of upholders or obligers, people that only meet outer expectations, we're going to be working on completely different avenues there. So as much as I have brought up things like the AIQ, the athletic intelligence quotient, all of these cognitive assessments, if you ask me what I would do in my first day of being a head coach, it would probably be to administer. I say administer, I'm not a psychologist, and that's not what this would be, but administer these things like the 4 tendencies assessment, getting a sense of, okay, well, who are my questioners? Because I have to understand that I have to provide them information and motivate them in a way that explains why this particular action is important to them as a person, them as a player, whether that be their position group or just the team as a whole. It has to be something that resonates with them on the inside. And then once we get there, it's not that hard to motivate that person. Then I have my obligers. And yeah, it's probably easier for me to teach to them knowing that they only really care to meet outer expectations. But those are the guys that I would kind of take aside and kind of try to figure out what their actual internal motivation may or may not be. Because I think compliance is, sure, that's, a helpful quality to have, but I guess it would kind of be, not compliance, because that's really where the issue is are you just complying because you're afraid of the consequences, because this is what you feel like you should do? To encourage players that if they're lacking the ability to see the forest for the trees in that situation, to speak up about it. If I have my rebels, I might have to do something with them, but also knowing who the guys are, that if it's an external or an internal motivation, it doesn't matter. Those are probably your easiest leaders. And even if they're not a team captain, identifying those guys in each position group, seeing how they can work together. I remember all these team building things we did at the VA, and it seemed kind of annoying at times. And especially when you're working for the federal government and you have the resources and limited access to which, all we were all kind of thinking about each time we did these things was, I have so much work that I need to get back to. But I learned so much about my coworkers in that environment. And that was really because of the time that we spent doing these types of assessments. I actually think we gave something similar to this as one of the activities that we did. And we all wore a colored square on us to depict what that was. And we all had to kind of guess what that was about each person. And it was something that wasn't exactly the four tendencies, but it was similar enough from a motivation perspective. That also helped me learn who I identified with as a person. And that helped me when I had to go to someone for advice, for guidance, who I was thinking of wanting to learn from. And I just think that the more that you give either students, give people under you in a workplace environment, or your athletes and your players these tools to learn about themselves and learn about their teammates, their coaches in the meantime, that makes all the conversation about game planning and things like that much easier. But it's not always about mental health. It's not always this grandstanding thing of crisis when we talk about, the kind of mental side of that in coaching. I think it's really important, especially thinking about Ole Miss, that they all became first aid mental health certified. That's extremely impressive to me. And it also makes me kind of angry why that's something that they had to be the first college program in D1 football to be fully certified in that. But it's also the psychology of just general things, again, like learning and motivation and people and how to communicate, how to get your messages across, how to frame messages in a way that gets what you want to say across, but also is resonating in the guys that you're speaking to. Go back to the jury consulting idea. You can have the best argument in the world, but if you're not providing that argument in a way that people are going to understand and care about, then you might as well not have an argument at all. Go. So I kind of go through these thoughts in my head, as I said earlier, just having kind of that personal interest in coaching. It also is just kind of a natural curiosity as much as it is kind of a vested interest, where I've always just been a curious person, and coaching to me is something that's way less explored than the actual team component of things, because that's, what's happening on the field the whole time. You only get the shots of the coach off the field. But, thinking of if I was to kind of go into coaching, what would I be able to offer, considering that I don't have the benefit of experience whatsoever in the sport that I would have any type of interest in trying to coach people up in. And if I'm kind of looking at myself and what my strengths are, to me, it would really be the psychology aspect of things and leaning into that as much as possible. I think that there's this idea of a women's touch, and that kind of goes back more to leaning into emotions. I think you can also see that principle play out in Dan Campbell, and that he's not afraid to show tears, that he has been visibly upset after losses and really carries that emotion with him. I think as much as this discussion of emotions and players, and that we're allowing kind of these things to take more of a spotlight, to me, emotions have always been in the game, and you see it in a guy's competitive spirit. We can criticize how people's competitive spirits lead to them perhaps not shaking hands with the opposing players before running off, but I always just try to take that all with a grain of salt, and that these guys all just finished what's going to be the most competitive part of their week. I'm not really going to get into the weeds of how these competitors respond in the face of loss to the other team, as long as they're not actively either harassing or in any type of way antagonizing the other team. I care a little less about immediate following the game, that kind of candor, and thinking about kind of criticisms, I guess, of, reporters in locker rooms over seasons, and asking players things that, when a player just had a hard loss, asking them to really dig into those decisions isn't necessarily always the best avenue. I have found that really playing out in practice as Tulane sideline reporter, and kind of figuring out how to approach these guys after losing game after game. And I don't think I really realized how much of the principles of psychology I was tapping into as a sideline reporter. But now that I'm kind of sitting here doing this kind of roundtable on coaching and psychology, it makes me realize that I was also drawing from those as well. So again, we're very much in a dead month of there's nothing going on. There's, we're past June post-June designations, cuts and whatnot, and there's nothing really going on until training camp. So I could sit here and kind of go over the teams that I cover and beat them to death with a stick, and the Saints and Tulane. But to me, this is really a good opportunity to explore something that I've always had an interest in, and kind of tap into the curiosity of my listeners, that I think I've kind of settled in on this base of people that genuinely just love to learn and learn about the game of football. And I think there's just as much as an important aspect in coaching as there is in scouting, and how scouting applies to team decisions on personnel. But now that you have the personnel all in one room, what are the coaches doing? How do you take this group of guys in a bad situation and get them to see a pathway to success? And I've been lucky enough to see that now both on the college level and following the NFL for, essentially my entire life. And growing up with teams of choice as the Saints and the Browns, the Browns being my dad's team growing up. Neither of those teams were the 49ers, which was the city that I lived in and the team I could have followed if I didn't have this, loyalty to the Saints instilled in me by my mom. And it also would have been a lot easier. When my dad moved to the Bay Area, it was when Joe Montana was at quarterback. I don't think it was that hard to get his interest in that as a Browns fan, but seeing all these years of kind of perennial dysfunction, it helps you also see how to get out of that spiral and what really plays into turning something around. And then I've just been lucky enough to experience that in spades on the sideline. So that's kind of my game plan for this month, if you will. It's just kind of delving into, again, a lot of these rich books that I have that have just been sitting on my shelf. And this almost gives me kind of a reason to read through them and hopefully share those insights with you as we head into going into training camp and kind of looking at these principles when I have the freedom to do so. So as always, I'm going to stick to my format of having a guest on Fridays, trying to think of how I can kind of bring this principle into that, but not wanting to put anything in too much of a box because you don't want to, when you're too creative, sometimes you can be a little too creative, to say the least, and trying to kind of leave that freedom on here. So as always, if you guys could remember to like and subscribe to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, I really appreciate it. I hope you guys have enjoyed the several avenues that I've kind of explored on the show so far, and hopefully see how we all do with kind of a longer form series.